Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 6, we're asking if and how our human rights are threatened by the Covid-19 pandemic. I'm Todd. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Aoife Nolan, Professor of International Human Rights Law and co-director of the University of Nottingham Human Rights Law Centre. She's also the Vice President of the European Committee of Social Rights and an academic expert member of Doughty Street Chambers, where she is co-lead of the Children's Rights Group. And it's the human rights of children that we are discussing today, in particular, how they've been affected by COVID-19. So Aoife, it's great having you here on this episode of the Rights Track. We've seen a lot in the press about school closures, lockdowns, schools reopening, the safety, the ratio of staff to student numbers, testing, masks, all the debates around COVID. But from your perspective, from a children's rights perspective, what are your first observations about the interaction between children's rights protections as in law, children's rights as they're exercised, and how those interact with the progress of the pandemic?
I think the first thing that we need to bear in mind as we look at the relationship or the interrelatedness or the mutual impacts of children's rights and the pandemic is to look at the very serious impacts that the pandemic and state responses to the pandemic have had in terms of children's rights. We've seen a wide range of issues, very wide range of issues globally. You've made reference to school closures, for instance, and the resultant interruptions in education, as well as, of course, reduced access to food in places where there's heavy reliance on school meals. I'm thinking there's been some very famous litigation brought in South Africa to challenge that issue directly. And of course, it's been a big issue here in the UK, lack of access to school meals due to school closures during COVID. There's growing concern about a global mental health crisis for children and young people as a result of the pandemic, lockdown, school closures, etc. There's fairly terrifying evidence of increased levels of child abuse and domestic violence, both during and after lockdown, in part to do with the enforced constant company of children with adults in highly pressurized and often substandard housing conditions, at least partially attributable to the huge mental stress that some adults have been put under in the context of the pandemic. Again, during the context of lockdown, it has really thrown into sharp relief the impacts of poor housing on children and their families. We've seen a very severe loss of social and play opportunities, reduced contact with loved ones, which all have a very significant impact on children's development and in some cases their survival. One of the issues that is really becoming ever more clear in the context of the move towards online education, we're seeing increased exposure of children to the risk of online harm, which is perhaps a less foreseeable result of school closures. Here I've identified a number of different things that children have experienced, but they all map onto the rights of children and the obligations, the duties that states have with regards to giving effect to those rights. So we have, for instance, children's right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. We have the child's right to live free from violence, the child's right to a standard of living adequate for their development, children's family rights, children's right to adequate housing, children's right to play. All of these have been affected by the pandemic and very seriously in some instances. And one of the key things I think that we need to bear in mind when we think about how children's rights have been impacted by the pandemic is the fact that not all children have been affected equally. The pandemic has absolutely entrenched inequalities that existed in terms of rights enjoyment between different groups of children. Poor children were hit harder, disabled children were hit harder, minority children in many countries were hit harder. This disproportionate impact needs to be borne in mind if we're not going to have a situation where the unequal impact of the pandemic on children's rights is perpetuated.
Okay, so let's just pause there for a moment. That's a panoply of impacts, disproportionalities, inequalities, etc. And I note that you've written about the compatibility or not between government measures to combat the pandemic and the protection of children's rights. And, there's this term in law, derogation from your obligations owing to an existential threat. So is COVID an existential threat? And do you think the government response in some ways was compatible or partially compatible with rights obligations?
I think it entirely depends on where you look. I think that there were a whole host of political, legal, social, and economic factors that shaped government responses, both with regards to children and more broadly. I think if we're thinking about the standards that governments had to adhere to when it comes to giving effect to children's rights, it's useful for us to look at the language that was used by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, the treaty body that has the mandate to supervise state efforts to give effect to this seminal standard, the seminal treaty on children's rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is a treaty that has been signed up to all UN member states apart from the United States. And that body, that committee, when considering the extent of permissible state, shall we say, limitations rather than derogations on rights, the committee recognized that in crisis situations, international human rights law exceptionally permits measures that may restrict the enjoyment of certain human rights in order to protect public health. And of course, that's a very pragmatic statement from the committee. But very importantly, it went on to say such restrictions must be imposed only when necessary, be proportionate, and kept to an absolute minimum.
So these are crucial points. I mean, there's almost universal participation in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'll get back to the outlier case of the United States in a moment, which is troubling and a bit surprising for our listeners, I'm sure. But this idea of proportionality of response and the measured way in which governments respond to things. There's been a lot of criticism in the press for some anti-lockdown groups and others who said, look, this is far too harsh. Kids are being destroyed. They don't have time to play. If they can play, there's a rule of six. There's not a rule of six. They can't go to the park. They can't do this. They can't do that. So the flourishing, the human flourishing that sits behind a child enjoying his or her life has been severely compromised by these measures. Are you critical of the measures that have been adopted? Are you critical of the timing and duration of those measures? And do you see that, now with the route map, certainly in the UK of coming out of lockdown, do you think that government is responding in an appropriate way?
Obviously, there's a huge diversity of measures that have been taken in different states, responding to the particular challenges that they face in the pandemic context. So, here in the UK, we see some very positive measures. We've seen situations where schools were closed in order to protect the rights to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to life of children, their carers, parents, teachers, etc. And at the same time, we've seen major shortcomings with regard to, for instance, provision of food and other support to families who are very reliant on the delivery of food and other support to children through schools. So on the one hand, school closures are positive. On the other hand, the failure to provide the necessary measures to support families in the context of school closures have been a major problem. One of the things that we've seen rather worryingly is that there's definitely examples of apparent efforts on the part of the government to instrumentalize the crisis in order to push forward agendas that are not necessarily consistent with child rights, and agendas that sometimes long predate the pandemic. And we see this, for instance, with regards to the attempts, some of which were challenged successfully, to relax obligations with regards to certain groups of children, for instance, children in public care and other contexts.
So this is these are highly vulnerable children, but, lurking behind this, you're suggesting there is an agenda that's outside or out with the concerns over the pandemic. So what is the agenda? Why was this followed, and why was the pandemic used to cover, if you will, for that?
You have a situation in this country where we've had long time efforts in some areas to weaken the protections required under statute. To take the example of social care, which is obviously a highly relevant and, I would say, politicized issue in the UK context, one of the things that we saw was that there was an effort made, and indeed steps taken, to introduce new social care regulations that reduce the extent of the duty that was owed to children in a social care context. We also saw a situation where we saw changes that significantly relaxed and amended local authorities' legal duties with regard to education, health and care needs assessments and plans for children with special educational needs and disabilities. Now, in fairness, some of these measures have now expired or been reversed. That has not been necessarily because there's been a change of heart on the part of government, but it has been largely due to this very assertive and effective campaigning on the part of children's rights actors and children and young people themselves. But I think, for instance, if you look at, say, the example of social care, this is a situation in which there has been long-term criticism of the government for an apparent agenda, what has been termed mass deregulation in children's social care. So this is a longer term thing. The feeling was that COVID was being used as an excuse, as a cover for this deregulation. And the fear was that while these were time-bound changes initially, would these in fact become permanently part of the regime that applied to children in a social care context?
So I think that's a really clear example. We've seen it in other areas, health outcomes, for example, for ethnic minority groups, all sorts of things.
It's a very significant issue. And I mean, in the case of the social care, we saw ultimately it went to the Court of Appeal, which found that the Secretary of State acted unlawfully for education. Secretary of State for Education acted unlawfully because he failed to consult bodies representing children in care, including the children's.
Yeah, what's the sanction for that then? Does that mean that policy is reversed, or that government had to change direction?
In this case, I think they had already changed direction. But it was, and what was important about the decision was really outlining the duty of consultation. And what was interesting in that case was that the department's children's rights team had carried out a child rights impact assessment, which had essentially said there was nothing to worry about here from a child rights perspective. And the court was very critical of that. And that's, of course, very worrying, because it's one thing for a measure to be taken that's undermining of children's rights and for the government not, to carry out that measure. But where you have a department that has essentially signed off that measure as compliant with children's rights because they've carried out a child rights impact assessment, that's much more worrying, because it suggests either children's rights are being deliberately disregarded, or more likely they're simply being misunderstood.
Yeah, now if we traveled across the Atlantic to the United States, I just wanted to talk about the outlier status of the United States. So it's one of the few countries in the world that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So a little bit of explanation around why that's the case. But then if we put that in the context of the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, there were huge debates about how do we get kids back to school in the United States. And Trump, in a sense, said, well, we're going to leave it to the states. They can just open up whenever they want to. Whereas Biden said, actually, yes, we can open up schools, but it takes resource. We need training for teachers. We need safety measures put in schools. We need to make our schools COVID secure. And that doesn't come for free. How do you think all of that is progressing in the US?
I'm not an expert on education in the US, and as you say, an awful lot of it is state-based. I think there's been a very significant change between obviously the Trump and the Biden administrations in terms of the level of federal intervention and policy making around the coronavirus. But when it comes to education, it is so strongly driven by state approaches that it's very hard to provide a uniform overview of the approach taken, I think. And I don't really feel in a position to comment on it in any detail. What I will say is that you cannot reopen schools safely without having adequate regulation, adequate inspections, adequate standards, adequate resourcing. Making schools COVID safe isn't free. And if there's a failure, whether it be at state or federal level, to acknowledge that, then you're not going to give effect to children's rights. And it should be borne in mind that, the US hasn't ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but there are education rights provisions in state constitutions. So there is case law, and there is a possibility of going to court around these issues potentially. It'll obviously depend on the constitutional provision at play and the state of, I suppose, strategic litigation work around children's rights in the particular state. But there is that scope. And just because a country hasn't signed up to the UN Convention doesn't mean there aren't relevant child rights or education rights standards that can be deployed to try to, shall we say, constrain or impact on state action.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the situation in South Africa. Tell us something about what's going on there.
So I think South Africa is a very interesting example of some of the key problems that arose in many countries following school closures and then indeed reopening. And what school closures immediately did was to amplify pre-existing inequalities in South Africa with regard to education, for instance, due to digital technology exclusion. You had a situation where education moved online, where you had communities and students that simply did not have internet access or did not have devices that would have enabled online education. And certainly South Africa is far from unique on this. The digital divide has been a huge issue in the context of COVID and education. But South Africa is an interesting example because there was so much advocacy and political discussion around it. And one of the things that we saw as well in South Africa was that you didn't just, when it came to schools reopening, you had this huge issue in some parts of the country of long-term shortcomings in terms of school infrastructure. and inadequate support for safe school reopening. And Amnesty issued a report earlier this year, which was highly critical about the fact that you saw reopening in South Africa, which was crucial to giving effect to the child's right to education. But this took place in non-COVID-19 safe schools. And that, of course, had implications for, the health rights of children, their families, the communities. And this raised a whole series of questions from the perspective not just of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also from the South African Constitution, which raises a whole range of child rights issues, including children's constitutional rights to education, health, food, etc. And so you had an awful lot of advocacy around that. You had applications to court around different aspects of the state's COVID response, for instance, failures to provide school meals when school reopened, etc. And now you have a situation where South Africa, where the schools are largely open again. But it is a very interesting example of the challenges that arose.
And if you permit me to press you a little bit, the situation in India is really heartbreaking in terms of the number of cases as well as the number of deaths and the provision of health services there. But surely there must be an impact on children in India as well.
I was looking at the UNICEF website today to try to gather statistics, but at this stage there simply aren't the numbers. And of course there are serious questions to be asked about how the Indian government is in fact, whether it's state or at national level, the extent to which in fact the numbers around COVID are in any way accurate. But as the absolute number of cases amongst the population go up, it will go up amongst children as well. So it's deeply worrying. It's not just the direct health impacts of COVID that matter. One of the things that was emphasized very, very strongly early on by UNICEF and other actors was the fact that the COVID pandemic would have very severe long-term indirect impacts on children's health that go beyond, say, did they get COVID? That may not be the question, but did they get their key vaccinations? Did they get the therapies or health interventions they needed at a particular time? COVID has made all of that much more complicated, and that will certainly be the case in India as well, where you're seeing wide-ranging lockdowns and closures of institutions across different parts of the country.
Yeah, and from your position then in the Council of Europe, I mean, how have the Council of Europe members responded, and what are the children's rights issues around mainland Europe?
I obviously need to be relatively careful about this. I'm, as a member of the body that monitors the European Social Charter, which is the leading Council of Europe instrument that includes a wide range of children's express rights. The European Convention on Human Rights applies to children as well, but has relatively limited express focus on children, whereas the European Social Charter provides very extensive protection to children's rights. I obviously can't draw conclusions or make comments on specific countries' records, but it's worth noting that the body that I'm on and the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and other actors working in the area have been very clear about worrying trends affecting children. Again, some of the things we've talked about, school closures, lack of access to healthcare services, mental health impacts, lost opportunities for play, social contact, etc. So what I would say is that there's a very wide range of concerns. But again, the specific impacts experienced by children in particular countries are something that need to be looked at on a case-to-case basis if we're thinking about evaluating them from a child rights perspective.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess that then turns to what are the children's rights activists doing? So an advocate for children's rights based in, maybe it's Doughty Chambers or it's another NGO based in London or elsewhere around the world. What are children's rights advocacy groups doing to mitigate the worst forms of what you've shared with us today?
I think they're doing a huge amount. I've been hugely impressed by the extent to which child rights advocates at the national, the regional, the international level have really moved into play with COVID. And, there are some positives of COVID. I mean, silly as that sounds, but there are some positives, right? For a start, it has made very clear how strong and how resilient the discourse of children's rights is. It's evident at the international level, for instance, that children's rights have formed part of the frameworks that are used by UN and Council of Europe actors responding to COVID. Okay, so we do see children's rights having traction when it comes to responding to the pandemic. And that is, of course, reflective of the long-term work by children and child rights advocates. The other thing I think that is hugely important work that we've seen is that, way back many months ago, we had a situation where when the UN Secretary General was launching the UN policy brief on COVID and children, At that point, there was very clear concern that children were going to be, to quote Secretary General, children are not the face of this pandemic, but they risk being among its biggest victims. And there was a lot of concern about that children would be invisible. It is very clear that that isn't the case. In fact, children have received significantly more attention in many countries than other groups that have been very badly affected. I'm thinking older people, I'm thinking disabled children. And again, that is reflective of the fact of relatively high awareness of children's particular position as a social group, and also the, children's rights, which is again reflective of the fantastic work that's been done in the long term by, child rights advocacy organizations. Children and their rights have received more attention than those of other groups whose rights have not received the same level of energetic support and advocacy prior to the pandemic.
That's very, very heartening to hear. And even if it's counterintuitive, it's heartening to hear. And I suppose the last area that I wanted to discuss with you is that, the Indian case notwithstanding, global trends appear to be getting better. Vaccinations appear to be rolling out at different paces and, hitting different groups. In the Biden's presidential address to Congress, he talks about up to 70% of 65 plus being vaccinated at least with the first dose, if not the second. So there has been a turn on this. What are the areas for hope in emerging from this very, very prolonged period of the pandemic?
If we're serious about ensuring that we come out of COVID and we come out of the pandemic, shall we say, a more child rights friendly world, more child rights consistent world, we have to make sure that children's rights are put at the heart of recovery efforts. We take children's rights and we treat them as they're intended to be, a framework for lawmaking, for policy making, for budget making as we move forward. When it starts coming down to the nitty gritty of economic policy and, financial packages, etc., goodness, rights language disappears, including child rights. Okay, so it's very much about taking meaningful steps to bring children's rights to bear on economic policy making and the work of those actors who are not generally lawyers, who are not child rights experts, who make the key decisions around economic policy making. Earlier this month, we saw a report produced by the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University and the International Confederation of Trade Unions and others that really warns of an emerging post-pandemic fiscal austerity shock that is one that will be far more premature and severe than the one that followed the global financial crisis. And they provide statistics that talk about the fact that in 2021 alone, we're expecting to see austerity cuts in 154 countries, moving up to, say, 159 in 2022. And we know that fiscal austerity as a policy was catastrophic for children's rights following the financial and economic crises of the 2000s. So if it happens again now, the child rights disaster that follows is entirely predictable. We need to acknowledge more squarely the structural injustice and inequalities that children face, and also structural injustices and inequalities that are severely exacerbated where children are part of disadvantaged social groups, right? And we need to be more direct and honest in acknowledging the inequalities of financial resources, of opportunities and power that COVID has served to underline and exacerbate. And unless we acknowledge those structural injustices and inequalities, we're not going to get past them because we're not actually looking at what the key problems are. And that applies in the COVID situation, but also more broadly.
And what about the voices of children in all of this, Aoife? Just how important are they?
These structural injustices and inequalities are severely exacerbated by the exclusion of children from decision-making processes about them, and that are extremely important when it comes to, say, defining and setting the parameters of law and policy making in the COVID context. Failure to take children and their views into account when we look at decision making around COVID is contrary to human rights law. The UN Convention sets out the right of the child to express their views freely in all matters affecting them, with those views to be given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. Not only do we have this human rights law standard, but in practice we see a huge amount of news at the moment around climate change activism, children in Asia and Latin America as political activists mobilizing around work conditions, etc. And we certainly have a growing understanding of children as child rights defenders. Okay, I mean, children are their own best advocates. Despite all this action, despite the fact that we're all very keen on Greta Thunberg and all this advocacy, and we think it's very exciting, it is patently clear that children's views have been largely ignored by government and supranational decision makers globally when it comes to COVID. This is inexcusable. There's a load of research out there that we can use to bring children's views and experiences to bear on policy making. If we want to ensure that children's rights are properly given effect to during and post-COVID, we have to acknowledge and we have to take concrete steps to address the structural injustice and inequalities that children face. They didn't start with COVID, and they aren't just going to disappear when it finishes.
So children's voices really are important in all of this. But I guess solidarity across and between generations is also key.
I think there's a real need for intergenerational solidarity. I don't mean that tritely, pictures of, children together with old people holding hands and everyone loves everyone. I mean proper intergenerational solidarity, where it's acknowledged that if the rights of one group in society, be it children, be it older persons, is being undermined, that has both short, medium and long-term implications for other groups of society. We need to work together. Children's rights people need to work with older persons groups, with the disabled persons groups, with women's rights group, with others, in order to push forward greater rights enjoyment for everyone. It's not just about children. Children are part of the community they're in. And if we just focus on children's rights, then we will miss the bigger picture. And that will in turn negatively impact back on children's rights.
Yeah, and that generational point is crucial. This is a pandemic generation. These kids will grow up with this in their memory, just like post-war children grew up with the experience of World War II, for example. And it's the generational point that really does bring us to almost full circle here. Because a lot of the episodes in the Rights Track, this series, looking at the impact of COVID, it was really around exacerbating pre-existing inequalities, disproportionalities, and action is required to redress some of those inequalities, even if the pandemic never happened. And now, of course, we have a situation coming out of the pandemic that those inequalities and disproportionalities are far more acute now than they were even a year ago. And so, the rights advocacy, the using of legal frameworks, whether those are at international level, at local level, domestic level, etc., really needs careful attention. And your final point about the solidarity of generations is crucial. There's been a lot in the press about the aged generation, older people, vulnerable people, but kids are vulnerable too. And that relationship, if you will, between all generations and human dignity that cuts across all generations of people for the future of the world is absolutely critical. So really everything you shared, from the panoply of impacts on children's lives to the measures that have been taken, some of the, as you say, the limitations, constraints and exceptionality as we emerge from the pandemic, real focused attention on the intergenerational solidarity really gives us a pathway to think about how we get out of the pandemic and how most people can enjoy their rights, exercise their rights as is mostly possible, given the frameworks and advocacy that you shared with us today. So for now, Aoife, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the Rights Track for this episode. And thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about the podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the Economic and Social Research Council. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to access all forthcoming episodes and our fantastic back catalogue of 5 series of sound evidence on human rights.